Thanks so much for the introduction and also the invitation as well to be here today. Super excited to present the work to you all. So my name's Jack Isles. I'm an architect originally from Australia. I've now been working for some time in Europe across issues surrounding both human rights and changing climates in various different capacities. Today I'm here more specifically wearing two hats, that of a researcher for Liminal based out of the University of Bologna and of cartographer with Swiss-based NGO Border Forensics. Both organizations have mutated out of Goldsmith's Department for Visual Cultures in London, working formally under the title of Forensic Oceanography. Each organization explores ways in which visual practices, design-based disciplines, and spatial analysis can contribute to our understanding of migratory struggles and border violence, with the ultimate aim of developing tools for resistance and methodologies for documenting and denouncing systemic violence at the hands of the state. Our work generally spans across numerous areas, and with the current support of the European Research Council, has focused on specific intervals along Europe's internal and external borders. Before the border, at Africa's Atlantic coast and the Sahara, where often externally driven extractive practices play a key role in forced displacements and migratory dynamics. At the border, in the central Mediterranean and the Swiss Alps, where systemic acts of state violence aim to complicate safe crossing into the European continent. And after the border in London and Calais, where ongoing institutional violence continues to hinder mobility for those attempting to make Europe their home. Today, however, I will focus more on the work surrounding the central Mediterranean. In the context of the central Mediterranean, the sea's liquid mass has undergone an immense territorial and military transformation in recent years. The proliferation of Fortress Europe and an ideological resistance to migration has seen the sea's surface transformed into an increasingly hostile environment for those attempting to cross it. In order to develop tools for resistance against the violations of basic human rights at sea, we have needed to grapple with the fundamental question: how to reconstruct violations and acts of state-sponsored violence when the weapon in question is the water itself. Working against the systemic violence of border practices across the Mediterranean Sea has invariably involved an analysis of the complex and clandestine military operations active in the area. An intricate network of EU and non-EU actors, such as national military organizations, but also that of Frontex, the European Union's Joint Border Force. This slide, presented by Vice Admiral Gortney to the US Department of Defense in 2011, outlined over 38 naval vessels operating in the central Mediterranean at the time, a historical peak in naval activity throughout the region. However, contrary to the high concentration of military assets in the area, only days after this slide was presented, a boat carrying 70 passengers departed from Libya for Europe was left adrift for 14 days, during which time 58 passengers tragically lost their lives. Our investigation into the events which led to the passenger's death was sadly the first of many, documenting negligent practices from EU border forces and an overall aversion towards assisting migrant vessels in distress. The methodologies and investigative practices developed throughout the investigation, entitled The Left to Die Boat, continued to guide much of our work today. The investigation focused on not only the vessels crossing northward towards Europe, shown here by an unbroken white line documented by a GPS device and satellite phone provided by the Libyan military upon their departure, but instead on the trajectory of the vessel as it drifted southward, shown here in a dashed white line. Having lost its engine and satellite phone, understanding the boat's trajectory south was crucial to understanding the events, or rather the absence of events, which led to their death. Documenting the ship's voyage back to the Libyan mainland required a composite of witness testimonies, cartography, and environmental analytics. In lieu of any precise GIS data, is this not connecting? There might be a problem with the cable. Now we're good. In lieu of any precise GIS data, such as the data provided by the satellite phone which we used to chart their journey northward. Our aim to document the ship's drift pattern southward was a crucial step in identifying potential acts of negligence from the various naval assets operating in close proximity to the boat's locations. Working with environmental scientists and open source climatological data, such as wind conditions shown here, we're able to reconstruct the amorphous movements of the sea's surface during the time in which the vessel was left adrift, revealing the boat's trajectory within a margin of error, often using the same data and technologies in use by the military organizations we seek to denounce. One key example of this was the use of remote sensing and synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, a common high-resolution sensing technique gathered by satellite sensors and space programs such as the European Space Agency. While SAR data is vital in verifying changes to the sea's surface made visible through drift patterns such as that which you see here, the data is also vital in the location of ships and often used by NATO forces to canvass the central Mediterranean from above. Instead, we sought to use the SAR data to invert the gaze, watching the watchman, in this case acquiring the location of vast assortments of NATO vessels operating in the region. Not only verifying the oceanic conditions during the time of the event, but monitoring the reflections made by large metal vessels as they sat dormant on the sea's deep blue surface. Maritime law stipulates vessels over a certain size need to utilize AIS identification systems, which allow vessels to report their location in the interest of transparency and collision reduction. However, military and naval vessels are almost always exempt from these restrictions. This means they often operate below the threshold of visibility, making it increasingly difficult to hold naval organizations accountable for their actions at sea. Hence, these returns which you see here prove to be vital in understanding the layout of NATO's naval operations and its proximity to the migrant vessel during its journey southward. The coalition of SAR, climatological, and AIS data which you see here allowed us to develop a detailed image of the sea just north of the Libyan coast during the days the migrant boat was left adrift. A process which confirmed our hypothesis that numerous unidentified yet most likely naval vessels were stationed adjacent to the boat's southward trajectory during the time in which the passengers were left to perish. A fact which is shown through our investigation would place NATO forces in direct contravention with international law and maritime protocols, obliging ships to provide assistance to neighboring vessels in distress. Our investigation would not have been made possible without the brave testimonies of survivors outlining the events which took place over their 14-day journey. Events which included numerous encounters with both naval vessels and aircraft that, whilst verified by our investigation, according to NATO personnel, never took place. These testimonies have thus become a vital component of not only our spatial reconstruction, yet also its subsequent inclusion in legal proceedings, seeking to hold accountable NATO governments for their actions. Many of these cases, launched by a coalition of NGOs, remain ongoing today, over 10 years later. Since then, tragically, these cases filed in France, Italy, Belgium, and Spain are now part of a growing list of legal actions which our spatial reconstructions have contributed to, each seeking to denounce NATO's and Frontex's implicity in violent crimes at sea and the transformation of the central Mediterranean into a weapon of exclusion. Since the Left to Die boat case, we have undertaken numerous investigations reconstructing border violence at sea, with each investigation presenting unique conditions and necessitating new forms of spatial analysis, such as the 2015 death by rescue case, which you see here, in which we utilized AIS data to document the tragic collision of a migrant and commercial vessel during an attempted rescue. A trend we witnessed increasing over the years as rescues by poorly equipped commercial vessels began to rise in the absence of state or naval assistance. As our investigative techniques changed and developed, so too did our access to different and more abundant forms of data. Only 5 years after our work on the Left to Die boat case, documentation of violence and rescues at sea were no longer only available in the form of remote sense data and witness testimony, but instead in film and footage recorded on the numerous phones, GoPros, and other devices that have become commonplace in migrant vessels and rescue ships alike. These developments allowed us to engage in finer-grained 3D modeling of events at sea, reconstructing the type and position of vessels through camera reconstructions in softwares such as Blender and Cinema 4D. Such as the techniques you see here developed in collaboration with forensic architecture to examine the accounts of events presented by Italian authorities relating to a rescue carried out by the German-flagged ship, the Juventa. Their account, which sought to criminalize the Juventa crew, subsequently resulted in the confiscation of their ship by claiming the rescue ship Juventa had returned empty boats to smugglers following a rescue. A clear example of the Italian authorities endeavoring to infringe upon non-government organizations' rights to fundamentally rescue at sea. Our investigation and reconstruction of the events prove these claims unfounded, exploring crucial practices for ensuring governmental and non-governmental organizations alike can remain active in search and rescue operations across the central Mediterranean. However, as our methodologies and practices developed, so too did the tactics of aversion and evasion by EU border forces, most notably Frontex, the organization now primarily responsible for EU border operations in the central Mediterranean. As we began to further our techniques for holding EU naval forces accountable to the International Convention for Maritime Safety, we began to witness a shift away from the use of seagoing vessels for surveillance. Ships which, due to maritime law, are obliged to provide assistance to other vessels in distress, and instead towards the use of aircraft exempt from such regulations. In 2021, Frontex added a Heron drone to its growing airborne fleet, operated primarily out of Malta International Airport, where you see it filmed here. The drone for us is so far the pinnacle, or perhaps the clearest example, of Frontex's endeavors to reduce the presence of their ships and officers in the central Mediterranean, evading their obligation to assist vessels in distress and instead using a complex assortment of aerial assets, remote sensing technologies, live streams, and mission controls to patrol the central Mediterranean from above. Yet perhaps most troubling is the adoption of collaborative techniques by Frontex involving the Libyan Coast Guard, often utilizing their aerial patrols to alert the Libyan Coast Guard as to the position of migrant vessels, full knowing they risk being returned to human rights violations upon return to Libya. Let's see. In collaboration with Human Rights Watch, we produced a report reconstructing the events. Oh, sorry, this is lagging a little bit. One sec. Let's see, is this working? Great. In collaboration with Human Rights Watch, we produced a report reconstructing the events of a 30th of July case in 2021, during which interactions with the Frontex drone led to numerous interceptions or pullbacks at the hands of the Libyan Coast Guard. Through reconstructing witness testimonies and data from organizations such as Alarm Phone, whom recorded the location of several satellite phone calls made from the migrant vessels, we were able to map out the position of both the vessels and the Frontex drone using flight data from the drone acquired by ADSB Exchange. What's important to note is that unlike naval vessels being exempt from reporting location data, civic airspace operates according to very different laws and regulations, with the reporting of location data such as that which you see being used here a mandatory requirement for all aircraft operating in civilian airspace. The evidence we collected strongly suggested that the drone played a key role in facilitating the interception of potentially hundreds of people, supporting the conclusion that Frontex aerial surveillance forms a central plank of the EU's strategy to prevent migrants and asylum seekers from reaching Europe by boat. However, what interested us most were the geometries and patterns which formed during the drone's flight, as we began to understand its flight data in the context of the rescues and interceptions which occurred during that day. The geometries which emerged seemed not only to be clear deviation from the drone's automated patrol route, but signifies that the drone had indeed sighted one of the numerous vessels of interest below, leading us to reflect upon how a study of the drone's aerial geometries could provide us with a window to understand and even preempt its otherwise clandestine operations. However, to do this, we needed more data through which we could test our hypothesis. During our research, we received a leaked document via confidential channels outlining the location of all known interceptions of migrant vessels by the Libyan Coast Guard between November 2021 and 2022. Considering Frontex itself had since admitted that over 50% of sightings by its Heron drone led to rescues at the hands of the Libyan Coast Guard, we thought such interceptions would be a good place to start an extensive analysis of patterns in the drone's behavior. Through filtering the data set by specific dates and adding the drone flight data for the same date, we're able to expand our study of the drone's movements in relation to the confirmed interceptions by the Libyan Coast Guard. The results were positive, whilst numerous factors in both the data itself and our understanding of it need to be refined. It provided us with a means upon which we could begin to classify a taxonomy of the drone's behavior and flight patterns. Each test yielded a series of geometries and relationships of turns and loops, which, once studied, could be used to identify movements or formations in the drone's flight data, which might signify visual contact with the migrant boats below. What's pertinent about this data is that, unlike previous work in which positive advancements with AIS data or identification systems for naval vessels would simply be met with higher restrictions upon access to the data itself, the intrinsic nature of civic and public airspace means that such restrictions seem so far unlikely. Fortunately, we've been able to continue to supply ourselves with data on the drone's operations and other aerial assets operating on behalf of Frontex via ADSB Exchange's open source platform. Initial tests to train machine learning devices based on our research further yielded interesting outcomes. Allowing machine learning to ingest data sets relating to Frontex aerial assets opened us to the possibility of interpreting their operations in real time, potentially allowing us to alert non-governmental organizations as to the location of migrant vessels potentially facing imminent return to Libya at the hands of the Frontex drone and Libyan Coast Guard. It is through examples such as this that we see spatial reconstructions of violence at sea, operating not only within a legal framework, but equipping organizations at the front line of search and rescue operations with the tools to resist against the inherent violence and exclusive activities of the state. However, whilst our early tests regarding flight data and its predictive capacity were promising, one large gap remained in our research and general understanding of the drone's operations, that being how it sees. In terms of understanding what a change or pattern in the drone's behavior might mean, we needed to further interrogate the technical devices used by the drone to image the sea's surface. The following video we recently produced and sharing here for the first time outlines the extents and current limitations of our research regarding the drone's sensory operations. It is our hope that research efforts such as this further drive discussions and transparency around the sensorial technologies operating throughout the skies above the central Mediterranean, providing open source research communities with the know-how to question and investigate aerial operations and their role in stemming migration to Europe.
Since 2018, European authorities have increasingly relied on an extensive web of manned and unmanned aircraft to monitor its maritime borders in the central Mediterranean. This network of aerial surveillance allows European authorities, and in particular the EU's Border and Coast Guard agency Frontex, to spot migrant boats crossing early on in their journey and direct the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept and return them to Libya, where they often face arbitrary detention, violence, and exploitation. In the summer of 2021, Frontex added to its increasing aerial arsenal a remote-piloted Heron drone operating out of Malta Airport, which has arguably become a cornerstone of its aerial operations. In order to understand the drone's surveillance activities and how these lead to interceptions to Libya, we tried to find out more about its sensors and their operational range. Since not much information is publicly available, we analyzed the drone's sensing capabilities through open source research, forensic methods, data, and image analysis. Our aim was to answer a simple question: how does the drone see? As specified in Frontex's response to a parliamentary question, the Heron drone is equipped with an ELM-2022A V3 maritime patrol radar, which allows it to detect vessels of interest at sea from far afield. Once the products manufactured indicates that this device can detect small vessels at 40 nautical miles distance, our analysis of the drone's flight data suggests its usual detection range is likely smaller. By analyzing the drone's flight tracks over a year's time, we were able to determine a search pattern flown regularly by the drone off the coast of Libya. The spacing and design of this pattern, known as a parallel sweep search, provide valuable empirical insights into the aircraft's sensory range. The 10 kilometers distance between parallel search legs flown by the drone indicates that this is likely the range within which its radar can detect boats at sea with a high degree of certitude. While this is likely a conservative estimate, it already implies the drone's ability to image over 10,000 square kilometers of the sea's surface during a typical day's flight, such as on the 24th of August 2021 shown here. The extensive reach of the drone's radar highlights the expansive reach of its early detection systems, which plays a critical role in making interceptions to Libya possible. While non-optical detection systems such as radar are the primary means through which the Heron drone first canvasses the central Mediterranean, visual sighting is crucial in confirming the identity and status of vessels at sea. The drone streams a live video feed to Maltese authorities and to Frontex headquarters in Warsaw, where images are analyzed by the agency's staff and other experts. Critical decisions about whether to provide or withhold assistance and how take place across a wide assemblage of technologies of visualization that extend not only across a network of airborne sensors, ground stations, and satellite relays, but also across various legislative and jurisdictional frameworks. Through open source research, we analyzed photographs and footage taken by different Frontex aerial assets and published online by the Libyan Coast Guard and others. These silent images, showing indistinct masses of passengers with the surgical yet detached vision from above, have come to play a key role in the spectacularization of border apprehension that fuels imaginaries of invasion. Yet some of them contain information that allows to better understand how the drone camera operates. For instance, on this image taken by the Heron drone's daylight camera on August 24, 2001, showing an empty fishing vessel on fire in the central Mediterranean, we can read the position of the aircraft and the pictured vessel. Through an analysis of the locations appearing on screen and the aircraft's flight tracks, we were able to reconstruct the drone's position, altitude, and distance from the burning vessel at the time when this image was taken. This reconstruction provided us with the necessary data to calculate a confirmed minimum range of 3.3 kilometers for the drone's daytime camera. At night, the drone uses the thermal camera to locate and assess the conditions of potential vessels of interest. In the early morning of the 26th of August 2022, the Heron drone captured several segments of footage of a drifting migrant vessel in distress, which was eventually rescued by the Nadir of the NGO rescue ship. People on board reported an aircraft visited them twice. Footage of the encounter was published on social media by Frontex, with a short post describing a timely rescue intervention allegedly facilitated by the drone. The account of the event emerging from other sources, though, appears very different. The crew of the Nadir never received the Mayday call Frontex claims to have broadcasted, despite their proximity to the events. Moreover, before being rescued, the boat was left adrift for several hours, during which the people on board periodically reported their changing locations to the alarm phone emergency hotline. By cross-referencing these locations with the drone's flight data and witness testimonies, we were able to deduce the likely position of the drone when each segment of footage was taken. Initially, from above during the drone's inspection of the vessel as it drifted towards south, and later during the rescue itself at 5:30 AM, when the drone just got close to the scene once more before turning away. Through locating the closest possible point along the drone's flight path from which the video of the rescue could have been taken, we were able to confirm a minimum range of the drone's thermal camera amounting to at least 2.5 kilometers. Taken together, the range of Frontex drone detection systems constitutes a far-reaching, haunting atmosphere of surveillance. The quantification and analysis of the drone's sensory range and behavior across numerous days of operation helps us to understand its critical role in the early detection of migrants at sea, without which it would be impossible for the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept them. This shows how surveillance from the sky has become a central plank of the EU strategy to prevent people on the move from reaching Europe by boat, and knowingly return them to abuse in Libya. However, a purely cartographic analysis does not fully account for the wider, effective footprint of aerial operations and its inherent violence, which clearly emerges instead from the testimonies of those attempting to escape Libya by boat. Their accounts reveal a fundamental asymmetry of vision. When observed from below, the drone remains an inconspicuous and elusive presence, often just barely audible and quick to disappear again in the skies, indifferent to the fate of those seeking help below. The silence that follows on board after such brief encounters remains suspended between the residual hope for rescue and the growing fear of being returned to Libya, only to be shattered by cries of desperation when a Libyan patrol vessel appears on the horizon, long after the drone has already left the scene.
So yeah, I hope the presentation has sort of provided some insights into the types of technologies, data, and sort of skill sets and methodologies involved in the work we do. There's no sort of context for questions here, but you know, please do feel free to get in touch should you have any. Thank you for your time and your interest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.